Near the end of 1961, the Duperrault family of Green Bay, Wisconsin headed to Fort Lauderdale, Florida for a week's vacation. The father, Arthur, and his wife Jean brought their 3 children, Brian, age 14, Terry Jo, age 11, and Renee, age 7. A lifelong sailing enthusiast, Arthur dreamed of living on a sailboat for a year, and this week-long trip was like a test drive to see how the family would hold up to life at sea. In Fort Lauderdale, the family meets Julian Harvey, captain of their rented sailboat named Bluebell, and his wife, Mary Denis. On Wednesday, November 8, 1961, Bluebell left port, destined for the Bimini Islands, and the family spent the next 4 days enjoying their voyage. Around 9 p.m. on Sunday night, Terry Jo went to her sleeping quarters in the back of the boat, without her younger sister Renee, who usually slept in the same cabin. Sometime later, Terry Jo was awakened by her brother screaming for help, and the sounds of heavy footsteps above. Terrified, Terry Jo stayed in bed, but a few minutes later, crept out of her room. In the main cabin, Terry found her mother and brother lying in a pool of blood and knew they were dead. Trying not to panic, the 11-year-old continued up the stairs and onto the deck, where she found more blood and Captain Harvey, who ran toward her and shoved her down the stairs. Terry Jo managed not to fall down the stairs and tried not to look at her mother and brother's bodies as she ran back to her room. Lying in bed, terrified, Terry Jo smelled something strange and heard water splashing. She realized the Bluebell was filling up with water. Before she could get out of bed, she saw a silhouette in the doorway. It looked like the captain, and he appeared to be holding a rifle. She remained frozen in her bed, listening to him breathing, unsure of his next move. The captain finally turned away, wading through the rising water, and climbed the stairs. Minutes later, Terry Jo sped from her bed and followed the captain. "Is the ship sinking?" she called out, unable to see anyone. "Yes," the captain shouted, rushing up from behind her. "Hold this." He handed her the line to the rescue dinghy, but in her frightened state, Terry couldn't hold on. The rope slipped through her hands, and the dinghy started to drift away. Captain Harvey dove overboard to catch it. Remembering the location of a small cork float, Terry Jo raced to the tiny vessel and tried to untie it from the ship. The lines got a bit crossed, and the small boat and Terry Jo were dragged below as the Bluebell sank. Luckily, the ropes became untangled, and Terry and her float returned to the surface, where it was cold and dark, and she had no idea where the captain was. With no food or water or protection from the elements, Terry floated for 4 days, enduring the relentless sun, long, cold nights, a disintegrating boat, and a multitude of creatures from below continuously nibbling at her feet and legs. A plane flew overhead on Tuesday, 2 days after the Bluebell sank, which gave Terry hope, but it passed by without any indication it saw the girl. Later that day, a pod of porpoises found the small boat and kept Terry company for a time. Wednesday brought hallucinations, and Thursday almost brought death. But an unnatural rumble roused the girl, and she opened her eyes to see a freight ship and several people waving to her from the bow. Terry Jo had been saved. But what of the captain? Julian Harvey had been picked up by an oil tanker on Monday, the day after the Bluebell sank. Harvey proceeded to tell the Coast Guard that the Bluebell suffered damage from a violent windstorm, and his clients, the Duperraults, and his wife Denis, were injured when both the masts and rigging fell. Ruptured gas lines in the engine room set the ship on fire, and he barely had time to get the dinghy untied before the ship sank, taking all the passengers with her. After a week in the hospital, Terry Jo had recovered enough to tell investigators her version of events, which contradicted the captain's account. The day after Harvey learned of Terry Jo's rescue, he returned to his hotel room and took his own life in the bathroom. So we will never know all of the details of what happened that night on board the Bluebell. What is known is that Mary Denis Harvey is Julian Harvey's 6th wife, whom he'd married only 4 months before this trip. Julian Harvey has also collected insurance payouts 3 times before, for a sunken yacht, a sunken powerboat, and a car accident that killed a previous wife and her mother, that investigators say he should not have survived the crash unless he knew it was coming. Police suspect Julian Harvey was attempting to kill his new wife to collect on a recently purchased insurance policy, but was interrupted by someone in the Duperrault family. Terry Jo deciding to sleep in her own bed is probably what saved her life that night. Terry Jo changed her name when she returned to Green Bay and didn't speak of her horrific days in paradise for almost 50 years. But in 2010, Terry published Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean, in hopes that her experience can help others heal from traumatic events.